Thank you for, oh, we're going to record. Okay. And good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. My name is Thaddeus Pope. I'm a professor of law here at Mitchell Hamline School of Law. We have over 140 people registered for this event, and the participants include lawyers, law students from Mitchell Hamline, law students from other law schools, undergraduate students interested in law school, healthcare professionals, law enforcement officials, community members, and others. And for the lawyers, this event is approved for 2.25 CLE credits. Today's program is part of the Health Law Institute's National Speaker Series, the goal of which is to invite experts in particular areas of health law and policy to our campus community to discuss and share information and perspectives on some of the most important and pressing issues of our time. And today's event, Theranos, When High Tech Meets Healthcare, is one such topic. As part of the Health Law Institute's commitment to making students practice ready upon graduation, we work to help the students hone practical skills, including the ability to communicate effectively. Accordingly, I'm pleased to introduce our student moderator for today's event, Hannah Williams. Hannah is a second-year law student here at Mitchell Hamline, specializing in health law through the Health Law Institute. She started her career as a critical care nurse and then moved into a role as a clinical research coordinator, where she operationalized drug and device trials for pediatric patients with type 1 diabetes. After graduation, Hannah plans to continue or to combine her clinical background with her law degree to help health systems solve complex regulatory problems. And so now I'll turn things over to Hannah.
Thank you, Professor Pope. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to introduce a great group of speakers. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping matters that I want to go over. We have a lot of content to get through today. In the interest of time, we've posted the speaker bios on our website. I highly encourage you all to take a few minutes to review, as the panel comes with a wealth of knowledge and experience. This event runs from now until 11:30 a.m. We'll start the presentations with Mark Gardner and Amanda Johnson, who will give an overview of the Theranos saga and the legal theories behind the case. We'll plan to take a short break from 10 to 10:10. When we reconvene, Seth Whitelaw and Manny Sapkalis will discuss where Theranos went wrong from a compliance standpoint and discuss mitigation strategies for organizations. Feel free to submit questions through the presentation using the chat feature. We'll hold the questions for the end of the presentations when we'll have a panel Q&A. And with that, let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce Mark Gardner and Amanda Johnson.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for attending.
Morning.
Amanda and I will run through some slides here. And if you could flip to the next one. These are our learning objectives for today. As I think saga is the right word that was just used by Hannah. This is our agenda. So we're going to go till about 10 a.m. And here's our bios. I'll give a brief background on myself. I've worked in healthcare for my whole career, 23 years. I've worked in medical device and actually I've worked at a lab for about 7 years, which is called MedTox, now LabCorp. So I have a background in device, or no problem. And I teach drug and device law along with Amanda at Mitchell Hamline School of Law. And our law firm focuses on FDA, anti-fraud, and privacy law. So Amanda and I practice together as well. Amanda, do you want to give a little background on yourself?
Yeah, sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. Should be a fun morning. Lots of interesting tidbits to share. My name is Amanda Johnson. I'm a managing attorney at Gardner Law. I've been with the firm for 2.5 years, practiced primarily FDA and anti-fraud law as it relates to healthcare fraud and abuse. I'm also an adjunct professor of law with Mark at Mitchell Hamline. We teach drug and device law, which is very fun. So prior to joining Gardner Law, I was a compliance officer for North America at Coloplast. I've been in industry my whole career, including United Health Group and Medtronic and Coloplast. Yeah, with that, I think we can get started. Dive right in.
Sounds great.
All right. So, and we were talking before this, we could talk hours about this case just because of the crazy facts, there's a love story, there's fraud, there's allegations, but wanted to kind of introduce you guys to the characters, so to speak, for today's discussion. So Elizabeth Holmes is on the left. She's the founder and CEO of Theranos. And Ramesh Sunny Balwani, so he's known as Sunny, was the president and chief operating officer at Theranos. And we have the little images on the bottom here just to illustrate the products. We'll talk more about that in a little bit here, but just wanted to introduce everybody to kind of who we'll be talking about. They have a blood testing technology that utilizes a very small drop of blood. And this is their little analyzer over here, a mini lab, which we'll talk about in detail here.
I would say, spoiler alert, they do become romantically involved.
Yes, spoiler alert, yes. We won't focus on that relationship,
No,
but it is an interesting fact. So right away, we wanted to just kind of start this morning with a list of all of the fraud allegations that were actually in the indictment against Holmes and Sunny. So I wouldn't normally read a slide like this, but I will go through each of these just because I think they're all very interesting and all very important to what we're going to be talking about today. So these are all fraud allegations against investors and patients and doctors. So they misrepresented, I knew that would be a tongue twister. Edison, which is their mini lab, their testing capabilities related to speed, accuracy, reliability, validation, and the range of clinical tests that machine could actually perform. They also misrepresented that Theranos as a company was financially strong and stable and growing. This one's really interesting. They did technology demonstrations for VIPs. I think they call them VIP demos. And they would actually, take a blood sample, put it into the mini lab. And then there was kind of a magic trick such that they would use kind of a null protocol to run a software and to mislead investors and others viewing the demonstration into thinking that machine was running their blood test, when actually they were bringing it back to the lab and running it either manually or on other commercially available analyzers. And that actually was really central to the government's case. They misrepresented a partnership with Walgreens, how it was going, how it was structured, and then future plans with Walgreens. There was misrepresentations made as to the relationship with the government and specifically with the Department of Defense. So Theranos had told investors that their mini lab, or Edison, was actually used in the battlefield and on helicopters in war zones. And then number 6, we'll kind of be focusing on, just because we are FDA experts, FDA attorneys, but they misrepresented the FDA regulatory status of their products. They had told investors that they were seeking FDA clearance or approval voluntarily just to show them that I think Elizabeth said it was the right thing to do. But FDA had told them on many occasions that they actually had to get approval or clearance for their analyzer and their tests. They misrepresented that tests were run on their equipment when they were actually using third-party commercially available analyzers, kind of like those. We'll have pictures of them in a few slides here. And in some cases, they were actually diluting samples to make up for the small volume of blood that they took and the larger volume that the commercially available analyzers required. They misrepresented that Theranos technology had been reviewed and validated by several outside companies and institutions when that had not occurred. And they made misrepresentations to media and the public. So kind of a mouthful, but just wanted to kind of set the stage for everything that was alleged in the indictment. And we'll go into kind of some more detail here. So it's interesting, they were actually indicted and charged with wire fraud. So that's how the case was litigated and prosecuted. So wire fraud, I won't read all of this, but essentially using a scheme or artifice to defraud by obtaining money or property through false or fraudulent pretenses, using wire, radio, television communication, and interstate commerce. So, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but that was kind of the jurisdictional hook that the government used, was that they used wire communications to purchase advertisements across state lines and tried to induce people to purchase their products based on those communications using wire. So yes, they were indicted with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. All right. And then Mark, do you want to talk a little bit more about some other central laws here?
Absolutely. And we'll, Amanda and I and Manny and Seth, we talked about the case a lot for the meeting, obviously, today. One thing Amanda and I were talking about was, well, why didn't they charge them under violations of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the FDCA, or CLIA, the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments? We don't know. We assume that it's probably because it's easier to convict them on wire fraud charges. You need there's a lot of fact gathering evidence that would need to be put together for these other, if you were to try and say, hey, you're violating CLIA or the FDCA. So that's our assumption. But in case you're unfamiliar with these laws, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, the name kind of gives it away. It regulates foods, drugs, cosmetics, also importantly, medical devices, which are used in diagnostic testing. There is some enforcement discretion around LDTs, laboratory developed tests, and we'll talk more about that later this morning. The Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments, we won't refer to it that way anymore. Today we'll just call it CLIA. And CLIA is a by law that regulates labs. So the regulations, and I'll just read here from a government website, it's from the CDC website actually, CLIA regulations include federal standards applicable to all U.S. facilities or sites that test human specimens for health assessment or to diagnose, prevent, or treat disease. And the group that, the government entity that enforces CLIA is CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. So it's a bit of a web in some ways. We could do a CLE just on how these laws interact and how some of the proposed amendments right now, where there's one camp that wants the FDA to regulate laboratories with CMS. There's another camp that wants the FDA completely out of everything. But there's sort of an interstices where in this slide, we talk about what the definition of a medical device is. And if you go to prong 2 of the definition here, it's under 201H of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, includes a device intended for use in the diagnosis of disease or other conditions, or in the cure, mitigation, treatment, prevention, disease, and other animals. So diagnosis of disease, clearly we're talking about a diagnostic device there. But so just to be clear, the takeaway on this slide is that FDA does regulate medical devices. Diagnostic tests are medical devices. There's some enforcement discretion when it comes to laboratory tests that are created at a lab, which Theranos did create its own test, and we'll talk more about that in a minute as well. Not to get too deep into FDA law, but medical devices are regulated based upon risk, class 1, 2, and 3. Class 1 would be like a tongue depressor, class 3 being a pacemaker, for example. And there are review and approval requirements based upon how risky a device is, how dangerous it is. Something like the Edison machine, if they want to put that into interstate commerce and sell it, to Walgreens or whomever licensed it, they would need to get clearance on that. We'll talk more about that in a minute. They did not get clearance for it. So just to, now we're switching into this LDT aspect. So I'll explain this because this is important to the case, because ultimately the camel's nose gets under the tent, and that the camel is FDA and CMS, and they really were the ones that pried this case open after whistleblowers went to them. This is from the FDA's website. You might be asking, well, what is an laboratory developed test? We'll call that an LDT for the rest of the presentation here. It's an LDT is a type of in vitro diagnostic test that is designed, manufactured, and used within a single laboratory. This is from the FDA website. And they go on to give an example where they say a hospital lab may create its own vitamin D assay, even though they could buy it from like Quest, for example, or someone else that manufactures assays, Roche. So the lab is allowed to make their own assays. This is I would think of this, analogize this with compounding, where a pharmacist is able to make a drug for a particular patient. Physicians could also make medical devices. If it's for a particular patient, they don't need to get approval from the FDA before doing so. So in the same vein, the government, the federal regulator, allows chemistry labs, for example, at hospitals to have their own tests that they develop, their LDTs. This is going further in terms of how these tests are regulated. The FDA states as follows: the FDA does not consider diagnostic devices to be LDTs if they are designed or manufactured completely or partly outside of the laboratory that offers and uses them. So what does that mean? That means that if the Edison machine, which we'll talk about more in a minute, that's central to the case, the Edison machine is the device that would do the testing for Theranos. If they're having a third party make that machine or parts of it, and then they're being shipped to Palo Alto, then that they're not an LDT any longer. We think that the LDT situation it's a bit it's subject to change right now, because there's the VALID Act, Verifying Accurate Leading Edge In Vitro Clinical Tests Development Act of 2021, that's out there. And ultimately, under the VALID Act, if it were passed and made law, the FDA would regulate all LDTs in laboratories, and they would share their jurisdiction with CMS. Rand Paul, on the other hand, Senator Rand Paul, he wrote a opposing bill, and he wants to say, hey, the FDA will have nothing to do with LDTs and regulating them. So we're not sure where this is going to wind up, but Amanda and I, we don't really, even if there were a law passed today, we don't think that FDA has the resources or time to really get into the regulation of these LDTs right now, because it would be a very big assignment and would take a huge budget to do so, and just the human resources necessary would be significant.
Yeah, the VALID Act really proposes a separate classification for it would be essentially adding on to, like, instead of medical devices, it would be IVDs or in vitro diagnostics. So it would be a whole separate regulatory paradigm for these tests. And I just can't see that happening in the near future, especially with resource constraints and such at FDA.
Yeah, in our practice, we have heard from FDA saying, we don't have the resources to review all of the applications in front of them for medical device, clearance or approval. So it's to pile this on top of it. We're not sure it's really feasible given the lack of expertise available right now. All industries have seen that, where hiring is a challenge, and FDA is no different. So I would say, I'll just say one last comment on the LDTs. If the test is made inside of a lab, like, we're presenting from Stillwater, Minnesota here today, I am. if Mayo Clinic, which is, down Highway 52 in Rochester, if they want to create their own assay for you name it, and it's all within Mayo at their lab, they have a very large core lab, by the way, in Rochester. They're allowed to do that without needing to go to the FDA first to get approval for that test. That's really the takeaway here. So let's talk a bit about the facts.
Yeah. And this slide is interesting. And I noticed they do have an FDA disclaimer on here, which is good.
Yeah, I saw that yesterday rehearsing it. If you blow it up, it says that
this technology has not been cleared or approved by the FDA and is not for sale in the United States.
Yeah. So after a lot of the trouble happened, Theranos brought in lawyers to try and fix things. And I'm sure that was added maybe by Heather King or someone that was there. So
Interesting.
It's a good thing to have on there.
It is. We'll give them a point for that one. But yeah, so we'll talk a little bit more about the facts, which, as we said, are quite interesting and fascinating. And we'll try to focus on those that are relevant to our discussion today. But here's a blown up picture of and I think this was actually presented by Elizabeth at, after some of the scrutiny started coming up, she actually went to the American Academy of Clinical Chemists and had presented this as kind of a rebuttal to scrutiny that she was getting. So I just thought that was interesting. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about Elizabeth. Who is Elizabeth? We'll get to know her a little bit. If you guys haven't watched any of the documentaries, I'd encourage you to do that. Just it shows a different side of her, and it's a lot of her talking, which is nice, interesting to see. So who is Elizabeth? She was an ambitious executive. She was, laser focused on revolutionizing healthcare, starting with addressing her needle phobia. So that's her kind of that's her story for why she started Theranos, is that she had a needle phobia. And so she wanted to find a way to use less blood so you wouldn't have to get a venous draw for traditional blood tests. She was viewed by many as the next Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. She was kind of viewed as a really aggressive, not aggressive, but ambitious. She slept very little. I think she drank cucumber smoothies all day. She was at the office really late. She idolized Steve Jobs. Just kind of gives you a sense of the personality. She did attend Stanford, where she studied chemical engineering, but she dropped out to start Theranos when she was 19 years old, which is crazy to me. And Mark, you can probably talk a little bit about her family lineage, but she has kind of an interesting group of family members.
Yeah, her great grandfather founded Fleischmann's Yeast. Great grandfather was leader of the University of Cincinnati College of Medicine. So part of the narrative was, hey, she's got DNA that is entrepreneurial and medically based, so it was kind of part of the narrative. She had ancestor that was apparently like a field general for Napoleon. And Amanda, you had found this, that her father was a VP at Enron. We kind of found that fascinating. Probably not part of the prestigious aspect of the lineage, but by all accounts, her father appears to be a good man that had a career in public service. I don't know how he ended up at Enron.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She also popped, in addition to the cucumber smoothies, chocolate covered coffee beans. I remember hearing one of the documentaries to stay awake. I don't think she slept enough.
No, yes, it sounds like it. So yeah, she was seen as a very hard worker, ambitious, entrepreneurial. She held various prestigious positions. I think she was on Harvard Medical School's Board of Fellows at one point. Just shot up kind of to fame very quickly. And I say fame because she was kind of like a celebrity figure. Yeah. She was on, the cover of magazines. She was associated with lots of the tech startups, Uber, Spotify, Facebook. She was kind of in with that crowd. And so she did her celebrity status, that is part of the story and part of the narrative. So, and I did not intend to wear a turtleneck today, I swear. I
Nice.
just realized that I match her, but anyways, that's funny. So we'll talk a little bit about just kind of an overview of building Theranos. It was founded in 2003 when she was 19. It really was in stealth mode, which is what she called it. So kind of quietly developing, working on projects until 2013. So about 10 years of just kind of building up well, she was doing fundraising, but also just building up kind of the company and the technology. The name Theranos is a combination of therapy and diagnosis. The mission of the company was really to revolutionize healthcare by making blood testing procedures cheaper than traditional labs like Quest and LabCorp and more available. So essentially her goal was to diagnose hundreds of conditions and diseases from one drop of blood. So when it came out, and some of you may remember, like it was pretty fascinating and interesting. Holmes attracted really prominent people into her orbit. She attracted high profile investors. I think these are all investors or board members: Henry Kissinger, Rupert Murdoch, James Mattis, former commander of Central Command and US Secretary of Defense. Betsy DeVos was the Secretary of Education under Trump. Larry Ellison, founder of Oracle, the Walmart family, George Schultz, who was a kind of a famous board member. He was in a lot of the podcasts and has been kind of out in the public eye with Elizabeth. Bill Frist, former Senate Majority Leader, many high-ranking military officials, politicians, investors from the financial community. She attracted this, this A-list of investors and board members. And it's just fascinating that she was able to do this, kind of as we'll get through the timeline. By 2014, the valuation for Theranos exceeded $9 billion. And Holmes owned a little over 50%. So she was, a billionaire essentially by 2014, actually before that, but. So again, we kind of break down the timeline a little bit more, and we'll go into a little bit more detail as it relates to the FDA and other aspects. So 2003, again, Theranos is founded. You can see 2004, 2007, 2010. She's doing fundraising, getting investors. The valuation is going up. By 2010, it was a $1 billion company. In 2013, Theranos really goes kind of public. They issue press releases. They announced their partnership with Walgreens. So essentially, they were creating wellness labs within Walgreens. That was their partnership. And they actually started doing testing in 2013 at Walgreens. She lobbied in Arizona to loosen restrictions on public access to lab testing. So typically when you get a lab test, you have to get a prescription or a physician order. She had opened some doors in Arizona such that patients could walk into Walgreens and, say, hey, I want a cholesterol test, or I want, this certain test. They also partnered with Safeway during this time. I don't know a ton of details on that, but it kind of started and stopped due to delays. I don't know, Mark, if you have any more insight on that.
Interestingly, Theranos was a big component of their plan in order to meet their goals as a corporation. And the CEO of that organization was personally involved and very intimately involved, and had a direct channel to Elizabeth. And it didn't come to fruition, and they probably dodged a bullet.
Yeah, exactly.
And we can flip back and forth, Amanda, if you like, here with some of the facts. So if you want to go to the next slide. I will comment one thing. In Arizona, they did lobby and had law passed. I mean, I do think to loosen restrictions on access to lab testing, which I think makes sense. I think it's a good idea for patients to be able to get diagnostic testing. There's obviously a limit to that, where having a physician involved is important so that they can interpret your test for you. But I know, having gone through COVID, all of us, I know we've had our son, who's very active as an athlete, whatnot, tested many times, and it was nice to be able to have him go to a lab and get a test without having to go see a doctor first every time. So there are, ultimately some of the motivations behind this company obviously are pure, but as we'll see, things, the truth got stretched out. So in 2014, now the valuation is $9 billion. Scrutiny is increasing though. So the wheels are starting to maybe not fall off yet, but starting to have some issues. One employee stated that less than 10% of the tests were run on the Edison. So they were saying that they could do 240 tests. This individual reported that 15 tests were run on the Edison and 60 more on analyzers using a dilution method. Another 130 tests were used on analyzers with traditional blood draws. So, in other words, the Edison is being used very little, and they're using other chemistry analyzers and whatnot to actually run the test. In 2015, this is to me where the wheels do start to fall off. Having worked in healthcare my whole career, having been a product manager at a couple companies, physicians are always testing companies on their science, because they're not going to take the word of the company. They want to see peer-reviewed published data, randomized controlled data, double, blinded if possible, etc. So in 2015, was published here. Stanford professor wrote in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, that no peer-reviewed research with Theranos had been published. So that was pretty damning. It started people questioning, started questions for sure. Also, I'd written here that people were there were reports that the lab tests were not matching up. So someone sent a specimen to Theranos, and it wasn't matching what was coming back from Quest or LabCorp, for example. They did in July 2015, Theranos herpes simplex test cleared by the FDA. That was the only product reviewed and ultimately cleared by the FDA. If you haven't watched the documentary yet, it's kind of fascinating, the party they throw for getting that FDA clearance, and they have like MC Hammer in the background. Very cringy, but you'll have to watch that if you're interested in hearing more about Theranos after today. Manny, you want to take the next one?
Yeah. So around the same time, we just thought this was interesting. Excuse me. In July of 2015, Elizabeth and Theranos hosted the then U.S. Vice President Joe Biden for a tour of the facility. It was reported that they created a fake lab for the tour, and I think this goes along the lines of kind of the VIP demos, where they would very carefully plan out these visits and what they would put in the room, and kind of what they would show. And so there was a lot of there was a lot of secrets around these visits. And so they would only show people certain parts of the lab, certain parts of the facilities. So it was very interesting. And even some of the employees said that they were never allowed in, some of the labs, which just kind of adds to the secrecy here.
And they tracked everybody by their key cards very carefully, where they were very controlling of information. And
Yeah.
we had a quote in here, we took it out, but she was being interviewed by Charlie Rose and said, "We are the most paranoid people on the planet," or something.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yes.
And it was, ostensibly to protect trade secrets. I think it was more likely to protect this charade that was occurring. But
yeah. So after they got clearance for the herpes simplex assay, some of the ex-employees had raised concerns to regulators, FDA, CMS, about concerns with the lab, with the test capabilities, kind of how things were running at Theranos. FDA ends up coming in to do an inspection, actually at both of their facilities in California. And Theranos was issued 2 FDA Form 483s, which those of you who kind of know what that means, FDA comes in and inspects, and then if they find that you're out of compliance with any of the FDA regulations, they issue you a form with essentially a summary of all the bad things that they found. And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but they had lots of observations. That was in August 2015. And then in October 2015, there was a, bombshell article published in the Wall Street Journal that leads to high profile lawyers going on the offense on behalf of Theranos. So she really did. And I think that is a big part of the story too, is how hard she fought kind of the allegations that kept coming up, even as the wheels were coming off. So that's interesting.
And that led to that book by John Carreyrou, the Wall Street Journal reporter, and The Bad Blood book is a very good book in case you're interested in reading that.
He has a podcast too, Bad Blood. I think it's like has additional information in it. It's very good. This is just a citation or a quote from one of the 43 reports. The containers for blood collection were not validated under actual or simulated use conditions, and Theranos was shipping this uncleared medical device in interstate commerce. And then around the same time, so CMS they had received complaints as well. They actually showed up for a surprise inspection in 2015. This quote is just intriguing to me, but essentially CMS concluded that the Theranos lab caused immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety relating to a test to determine the correct dose of the blood thinning drug warfarin. And so they actually got their Clia license suspended for 2 years, which means that you cannot perform laboratory tests. So here again, the wheels are continuing to fall off. Immediate jeopardy. That's not something you see from regulators very often.
No.
I'm
happy to cover this one, give you a break. So March 2016, as Amanda said, at this point, wheels are kind of falling off. There's just a lot taking place. The Journal of Clinical Investigation, 13 scientists state Theranos blood test results flagged outside their normal range 1.6 times more often than other testing services. And that 68% of tests evaluated showed significant inter-service variability, and lipid panel test results between Theranos and other clinical services were found non-equivalent. CMS regulators, as Amanda noted, announced sanctions, including suspending Holmes and Bouani from owning or operating a certified clinical lab for 2 years, and revoked the facility's license. Then in 2016, it's a federal investigation, criminal investigation for misleading investors and government officials about Theranos. In 2016, the U.S. House Representatives Committee on Energy and Commerce requested information from Theranos about remediation plans and ongoing adherence to federal guidelines. So at this point, they are like under pressure big time. The wheels are, as we'll see, are about to fall off completely here. Go to the next. Oh, here we are. So the result of the engagement with regulators, there were no FDA fines. CMS did have a $30,000 settlement, which is peanuts compared to the fraud they did. And then the license was officially revoked. Reports that CMS was not shown the Edison lab and questions raised around proficiency testing. So there's reports that when CMS came in, they didn't even show them the Edison laboratory, which is, there could be 18 USC 1001 charges as well here for arguably perhaps by, I don't know if that would be considered, lying to a federal officer if you're not showing them the lab. And then from March to June 2018, SEC, so everybody's getting involved, alleges fraud. Holmes and Bouani indicted on 11 counts of fraud and conspiracy, claiming they had engaged in elaborate years-long fraud to deceive investors into believing that its key product, portable blood analyzer, could conduct comprehensive blood tests from drops of blood. Holmes settles for $500,000, forfeits $19 million shares, which are turn out to be worthless, and barred from having a leadership position in a public company for 10 years. Bouani did not settle with the SEC. I should say that perhaps the shares aren't. The patents that exist today have been they're under a different company name, and I understand that there is some litigation around those patents for violators of them. So we'll see where all of this winds up in the future, if any of the patents. Maybe the state of the art just wasn't where it needed to be in order to do what Holmes set out to do. Certainly it wasn't. Maybe it will be in the future, but I'm not sure. The laws of physics may have just prevented that the goal that she had from being achieved. We'll see. And then Theranos finally is dissolved in September 2018. So yeah, man, I can kind of run through these. How did this, high flying company with 800 employees? It was like the hot Silicon Valley company with it was reported up to like a $10 billion valuation go to zero in 4 years. And did these once pure motivations? I mean, Elizabeth had pure motivations, help get access to testing, which would hopefully help prevent, mitigate, treat, et cetera, disease. But unfortunately, the science was just not behind it. So once pure motivations turned into lies.
And I think she truly did think that it could work or would work. And that's what's kind of the interesting part with this story.
And this sort of captures it. We're trying to capture that notion that, Edison was a very famous showman. There's a great book about his the AC/DC wars with Westinghouse. If you want a kind of another little bit of a legal saga type story involving Edison and Westinghouse suing each other. It's written from the attorney that defended Westinghouse, and it's sort of based on a true story. But I mean, it's based on a true story, but it's also an interesting story that it's dramatized a little bit. But it talks about how Edison really, I'll just read the quote. Nearly every man who develops an idea works it up to the point where it looks impossible, and then he gets discouraged. That is not the place to become discouraged. And I think Holmes, this was her approach. I have this idea, I'll figure it out, I'll sell it, I'll pre-sell it. That was something Edison was famous for, where he didn't perfect the light bulb until well after he said he did. So it's sort of interesting to me that the machine was named after this inventor, who's one of the most famous American inventors ever, but certainly was a showman and would push the envelope on making claims that weren't real, so kind of this fake it till you make it philosophy. And we'll go to so ultimately though, Pinocchio, kind of the story of just starting with a little lie and extending too far, I think is what happened. Another part of this story. Let's chat a little bit more about the products, man. Did you want to? Yeah. So we've kind of talked about them a little bit, but just wanted to break it down just so everybody's clear. So the box on the right there is the actual mini lab. So they had a couple names for it. I think the code name internally was Edison, and that's kind of what you see proliferated in media and accounts. But it was also called the mini lab. There was a few versions. There was an Edison 4.0, there was an Edison 3.5, and they also called it the Theranos Sample Processing Unit, or TSPU. So this is the actual analyzer. This little kind of hole in the front here is where the blood would actually go in, and they push it in kind of like a CD player, I guess. And then it presumably press a button and magic happens. So up here is just showing the finger prick. So really their kind of claim to fame was 1 drop of blood. So it's this tiny little blood collection container here is called the nanotainer. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. That becomes very central to the case. And then they also had a collection device, which presumably had a finger prick needle, and then the containers that came with it. And this quote I just love because it's kind of used in a lot of places in the media. I think it was actually in the Wall Street Journal. Elizabeth was describing her technology, and I think the Wall Street Journal described it as comically vague. So she said the chemistry is performed so that a chemical reaction occurs and generates a signal from the chemical interaction with the sample, which is then translated into a result, which is then reviewed by certified lab personnel. So it's just kind of funny because I don't know what that means. There's chemical reactions going on. So This was it. Yeah, that one was in the, I think it was the New Yorker, and the reporter was just appalled. If you watch the HBO
Yeah.
special, he talks about that quote.
Yeah. And this is the famous nanotainer here. This image is used a lot to illustrate the size of the nanotainer. So you can see how tiny it is compared to the vials of blood that you would get traditionally.
Image was huge, having these photo shoots and whatnot was a big driver for the company.
And so the nanotainer ends up being very important. Theranos took the position from an FDA perspective that this was a class 1 medical device, so the lowest risk, and they listed it with FDA as such, and they took the position that there was no pre-market clearance required for this product. But as we'll see in FDA's 43, they took the position, which prevails, of course, that the nanotainer is actually a class 2 medical device that would require 510(k) clearance prior to selling it into interstate commerce. And I just took a screenshot of the actual classification regulation, blood specimen collection device. Here's the description, class 2. If you look on the database, it says a 510(k) is required. So this is kind of what actually got them on FDA's radar, in a sense, because this was kind of the more egregious finding. Well, yes, on their 43, because it really did violate FDA regulations. Failure to gain clearance results in misbranding and adulteration. So this little tiny nanotainer device is kind of what ended up being a big issue from an FDA perspective. And then Edison, so mini lab or TSPU, the value proposition was that it was an affordable and accessible mini lab that could do hundreds of tests with only a small drop of blood, finger stick blood, which is different than venous blood via Lancet, where you would traditionally go and, they tie your arm off and they stick a needle and you sit there while they fill up vials.
I'll just comment on this, Amanda. If you've ever had like a finger stick, they use a lancet and they poke into your finger, and it hurts a lot. I would honestly almost rather have a needle go into my.
I agree.
Take the blood out, but that's just me. So I was kind of just a personal vibe that I got from all of this. That the idea is we don't want needles, or we're afraid of needles, but you're still breaking the skin.
I know.
Just a smaller something sharp, a lancet. So yeah, kind of interesting.
It is. And then the Edison, there are multiple variations of the mini lab, but it was essentially designed to perform immunoassays and then later to do like PCR type testing, and kind of combined all of the types of testing into one, which is interesting. But essentially immunoassays look for the presence of an antibody or antigen in bodily fluids. So looking for hormone levels, drug levels, cancer markers. And Theranos actually had a menu of tests that you could order on their website. So it's actually archived. It's not live anymore. But from 2016, you can scroll through more than 240 tests that they claimed that they could process on the Edison. And in reality, only about 12 to 20, it kind of varies based on the model, were actually run on the Edison.
And as you'll see, if you watch some of the documentaries and whatnot where they interview the engineers, they were just like, it's impossible to take. Yeah. And I think maybe here's a good depiction of it. I worked at a huge laboratory that's here in Minnesota. Was at the time when I worked there, was the 4th largest lab in the country, MedTox, and now it's a LabCorp lab. But we had tons of these types of machines in our lab, and that's where, a decade ago, following this, I remember we had like the Fortune magazine. I think I saw the article and her on the front, and hey, she's a billionaire, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, how is this possible? How do you get a machine like this in a little box? Like, I'm not smart enough apparently to get my head around that. But if you listen to the engineers, they're like, it was the laws of physics were what really prevented them from accomplishing this goal.
Yep. So thinking back to kind of when Mark described the LDT regulatory status and medical devices and how they're regulated. Theranos took the position that because they built this mini lab in-house, kind of in their lab, and ran the tests in their lab, that all of their equipment and all of their analyzers and assays were covered by Clia and CMS as an LDT, and thus kind of that FDA enforcement discretion applied. And Theranos wanted to sell this to, they wanted it in people's homes, they wanted it at Walgreens, they wanted it everywhere. And so in order to do that,
they wanted it in military helicopters.
yes, they wanted it in helicopters. But the minute you use it outside your lab, then it becomes a medical device, and it's no longer afforded that enforcement discretion from FDA as an LDT. So just wanted to kind of flush that out a little bit.
I think that was, their legal theory is we made this machine in our building, and therefore we are not subject to, or we can take advantage of this enforcement discretion. And ultimately, FDA rejects that position. But it theoretically, because we were talking about this in the lead up to the presentation, they were like, was the Edison, did FDA actually condone that the Edison wasn't a medical device? Or did they allow them to kind of continue with this argument that it's an LDT? And we do think that was the case, because they ended up clearing one assay for the device, and they go into detail in the summary, the 510K summary, around the Edison. So, but it's important to note that LDT enforcement discretion is just that, and the FDA could at any point change it. And obviously they did in this case eventually.
Yeah, and so Theranos has only one FDA clearance, which I just think is interesting. And it actually took almost a year to get cleared. And Mark was mentioning the celebratory party that they had afterward. It was awkward. But so they do have one clearance, which you can still go on FDA's website and look through the 510K summary. It was for a herpes simplex virus 1 assay. Shortly after the clearance, there were whistleblowers, ex-employees that had brought concerns to FDA about this assay specifically, which we'll see kind of becomes a bigger issue. But I also thought it was interesting. They tried to get clearance for an Ebola assay, and they tried to get an emergency use authorization for a Zika assay. And the stories behind those are all equally as fascinating, and we won't have time to get into them today, but just very, very interesting facts. But this is the only clearance approval they have from FDA.
One quick comment on this. You may be thinking, why is the FDA like playing ball with them? It's, if you remember back to the Joe Biden slide, things weren't really off the rails yet. In fact, the same month that Biden visited was when the FDA cleared the device. So they were still, that was around the time when people were starting to question. So after these whistleblowers, the camel's nose is under the tent. So we can go to the next slide. Here's this is from the 483. We think that this was for cause. It's impossible to determine that now unless we got the 482, and it might not be detailed in there. 482 is the notice of inspection. But the general reflection from the 43s was that the quality management system was non-existent. So there's no complaint handling, investigation process, design validation, design input requirements, risk analysis, design history records, quality audits. These were all at odds, and FDA highlighted observations related to these aspects that are pivotal to a quality management system, which were not in good shape at Theranos. And then they later received a third 43 for failure to obtain IRB approval prior to clinical investigation.
I think that was for the Ebola assay. So the FDA had come in again and issued another 43.
Great. So we're kind of on the final stretch here before we have a short break. But ultimately, Silicon Valley is a wonderful place, right? There's a ton of innovation that is driven a lot of our economy. You think of Apple and Google and so on. There's great things happening there. And there are a ton of life science companies, medical device, pharmaceutical companies in the Valley that are wonderful. But should they operate under this mantra of move faster, break things? You have Mark Zuckerberg here. We thought we'd pile on him, given that everybody else is right now. I guess it's not Facebook now; it's Meta, right?
Meta.
Whatever that means. But we can go to the next slide. In our view, the mantra does not translate to the healthcare industry. If you move fast and break things, you might kill people or make them sicker. That's not how operating rooms work. You don't move fast and break things. You have backup plans. If you're conducting surgery, you're prepped for that surgery. If you're a medical device company, you should have backup plans and redundancy systems in your quality management system where necessary, so that you're tracking complaints or whatever it may be, and following up on them. So ultimately, we feel like, when there was a quote that Holmes came out with, she said, I think the minute, this was in February 2015, I remember reading this and being like, that's tone deaf. She said, I think the minute that you have a backup plan, you've admitted that you're not going to succeed. That's not true. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It means that you're prepared for something to go wrong, hopefully. So again, we're picking on her, but I don't think that FDA, that sort of ethos is something that they'd like to hear from the CEO of a medical device company and laboratory company. And again, we made this point already, but quality management systems are designed with controls and redundancies to mitigate risk and prevent failures. So backup plans are the norm and often compulsory.
Yeah, I mean, that is the very intent of a quality management system, is planning for foreseeable issues that may come up and unforeseeable issues. So it's just kind of opposite of what this industry really is, which is interesting.
So final stretch here, Mandy, you want to talk a little bit about the conviction?
Yep. Yes. So as we kind of started out this morning, we're going to kind of circle back and finish with the indictment and the trial. We won't get into all the trial details, although that's interesting as well. But so, on June 14th, 2018, Holmes and Sonny were both indicted on 11 counts of fraud and conspiracy. They were charged together, but their trials are separate. They were charged with 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors, 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against doctors and patients, and 9 counts of wire fraud. They weren't charged with FDA violations, and we talked a little bit about that earlier. Not really sure why. There's no kind of government explanation for that. It's likely that the fraud was, sexier, and they probably had done a lot of the investigation related to SEC complaints. So they probably had done a lot of work for the financial fraud aspects of it as well. But that's a very interesting question, and still kind of a question mark in my mind. But also, they lost their license. FDA hadn't cleared or approved anything, so they probably just stopped. They ended up dissolving, so they probably stopped selling or stopped performing tests around 2016 anyway. And we talked about this earlier, but essentially kind of the case is based on the allegations that Theranos used interstate electronic wires to purchase advertisements intended to induce individuals to purchase Theranos blood tests at Walgreens stores in California and Arizona. So that's really the hook that they use from interstate commerce and electronic wire communications across state lines. So after a 4-month trial, this was, just in the news not long ago, on January 3rd, 2022, a little over a month ago, the jury found Elizabeth guilty on 4 of the 11 counts. So 3 counts of wire fraud against investors, 1 count of conspiring to commit wire fraud against investors. She was actually acquitted of all of the counts related to defrauding patients and doctors. The jury was deadlocked on 3 of the remaining counts. She did plead not guilty, which is why they went to trial. Everything I could find, they're assuming she will appeal. She will try to get this overturned. Right now, she's free. She's at home. on bond. She had a baby not long ago, so she's living with her husband and child until her sentencing hearing in September 2022. Not sure what she'll get for prison or a fine. A lot of people are saying that maybe a few years in prison, or it'll be very interesting to see how that goes and what she ends up getting. The maximum sentence is 20 years per count. She'll have fines, I'm sure, and restitution, but I don't know how financially, how she's doing financially. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And then Sunny's trial is expected to begin in March. And this is just a good quote from
My favorite quote.
Yes, this was one of Sunny's comments while I think he was on stage at like a town hall meeting at his company at Theranos. He said, we are a very conservative company because we think that you should get things done before you talk about them. That is the culture we created. So just very interesting.
We're not sure about that. I think that's it.
That is it.
I don't know if we have any questions or if we want to just yield that time to our break and to Seth and Manny here. So we give them plenty of time to present. We'll hand it back over to moderator.
Well, thank you, Mark and Amanda. And as Mark kind of said, feel free to pop any questions into the chat and we can address those after Seth and Manny's presentation. The time right now is 10:03. We are going to take a quick break and reconvene at 10:10. So we will see everyone then. It's my pleasure to introduce Seth Whitelaw and Manny Zopoulos, who detail what went wrong from a compliance standpoint and provide some recommendations for risk mitigation. Manny and Seth, go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks very much, Hannah, and welcome everyone. As Hannah said, we're going to shift our focus a little bit. We're going to move into a compliance sort of framework. Manny and I have both, you can read our bios, but just to synopsize, both of us have been working in the industry for a very long time, more than 2.5 decades for both of us. So we have a lot of experience on the compliance side within life sciences. I think where we want to begin today, we entitled our presentation The Power of Faith, because a large part of this has to do with Amanda and Mark did a great job of giving you the legal background, but there's also this human behavior aspect that's really important and is certainly fundamental to compliance. And we've got a couple of definitions on the screen. I'm not going to read them. You'll notice they're both religious in nature. That's because the best definitions we can find about what does faith really mean comes in a religious context, but we also see faith being a key facet of what happens at the senior executive level in a lot of companies as well. So with that, we're also going to take a look at con in a sort of a different sort of way. So we think there are probably three parts to this. There's a suspension of disbelief, there is misdirection on the part of Theranos, and then there's the greed component, which seems to interplay with everything that goes on in a for-profit business. At the end, you end up with an empty box, and you end up seeing only what you really want to see. So part of this was the investors, although they were defrauded by Theranos, they also really wanted this to succeed, and they really thought that this was a great idea. Manny?
Great, thanks, Seth. So one of the things that we often talk about is suspension of disbelief, right? And Seth, actually, to your previous point, I think what's interesting is Hope is Not a Strategy was the title of our article recently, right? In the sense of trying to get an understanding that there are a lot of difficult factors at play. And one of them is that you have this sort of disbelief in what's really going on. And Mark and Amanda did a great job talking about the fact that they really did believe in this message. And I listened to a great podcast. It was from Tyler Schultz, who's one of the whistleblowers that Amanda mentioned. And it was called the Compliance Perspectives Podcast. And what he talked about is, internally, there was a lot of that belief around making it cheaper, faster, and more accurate. And that's a really compelling patient message, right? It's, less invasive. There's not that, the disease detection. It's a single drop of blood, you often heard Elizabeth say, things of that nature. There's no trips inconveniencing somebody for the lab for any type of blood draws. The physician message, also very compelling. You could increase patient compliance and you could lead to improved health outcomes because of this. And even more so in the third bucket of the healthcare space, it was a really compelling payer message. You could decrease these brick and mortar costs because you have these collection points, analytical labs. And it's that decrease that reliance on large clinical labs. I think Mark was mentioning a clinical lab that he had worked with years ago, but you have these behemoths, Quest, LabCorp, and there's not a lot in between. So they wanted to sort of, as Elizabeth often said, she wanted to change the world with this. However, as we'll get into, that did not happen. One of the other things I wanted to note in that same podcast I mentioned with Tyler Schultz, he mentioned nobody wanted to be wrong, right? Everybody wanted to believe this. And that's all those players and the board of directors, Kissinger, Schultz, Frist, all those folks, they never wanted to admit that they were wrong about this. And they kept getting deeper and deeper. And there was a book that he had mentioned. It's a book called Being Wrong by Catherine Schultz, no relation, he said. But, the whole book is about how everybody has a passion not to be wrong. But sometimes, as we know in compliance, you have to take a step back. And when things don't look copacetic, you have to take a step back and make some decisions based off that. Next slide, Seth.
Yep.
Great. And now it's the misdirection piece. You had this David versus Goliath. She wanted to disrupt this. She was on Jim Cramer's show, again, changing the world. She was on all the news channels, everything. She was this small company that was going to overtake what's happening out there in this big healthcare space. And everybody wanted to believe that. She was extremely charismatic, very, very strong intensity. Even changed her voice a bit. I don't know if that was mentioned on the earlier part, but that's what people say. That's not her natural voice that you hear in many of the interviews when things were going well. But it was a level of intensity that was extremely, extremely targeted. This is what some people consider the next Apple 2.0. That's why she always wore the turtleneck, similar to Amanda before, but she always wore that turtleneck to emulate Steve Jobs, and that was her hero when it came to that. And she was a successful female entrepreneur. She really touted that, and that's why a lot of people wanted to believe. They wanted to back a female entrepreneur, and this was a great story. Change healthcare. And in the era of mystery, I find this one interesting because we have here a secretive black box. I have a case study later that I heard, and that I'll go into more detail. But it was referred to them as a magic kit. And again, we'll go into more detail on that case study in a bit. But I think that's really interesting because whenever you have something, that's when the questions should start coming forward. And I'll explain that in more detail in a bit as well. And then the refusal to allow detailed viewing behind the curtain because of proprietary methods. Again, there was something that was said in the previous session about them being paranoid. The most paranoid company in the world, but there's something to be said for IP, and then not allowing anybody to see it and just going on faith in a sense. And I think that was one of the challenges of this organization. Seth, back to you.
And on the greed side, look, this is an extremely lucrative market. Global home diagnostics is growing. It's growing at a fantastic rate. So there's an awful lot of money to be had on the table. And investors were obviously are always looking for the buy low, sell high mantra. They're looking to get in on the ground floor. And if you don't get in on the ground floor, you miss the boat, so to speak. So there was a desire by the investors, obviously, to make money, but obviously to get in the early stages. In the case of Walgreens, which again, Mark and Amanda talked about a bit, Walgreens had a couple of reasons for wanting this to be true. They're in a neck and neck battle with CVS and have been for years. CVS has minute clinics and has managed to increase its footprint tremendously. And Walgreens has always been running as the number 2 in the retail pharmacy market. They wanted to try to unseat CVS, and they saw this as one way to do it. Because this would be a standalone revenue generator. It would be a new way of generating revenue to bring people into the storefronts. And so Walgreens also wanted this to be true from the greed perspective as well, because they wanted to unseat CVS. They wanted to be number 1, and they wanted to grow their market share tremendously. Manny?
Great. I'll take this, Seth. So we have here Theranos, was started in 2004. That's really that's when they got their first funding. Amanda had noted that they were started in 2003. That's when they were founded. But the first funding was 2004, and that's when they were off and running. I think the note was something around 30 million or so. So it was funded very strongly, very early, right? And then there were many, many years of that media circuit, et cetera, trying to get these customers. And then John Carreyrou came out with that first Wall Street Journal article, and that was in October of 2015. This is what was interesting to us, was that the compliance officer that they finally put in place was hired in July of 2016. That's 13 years of trying to do business without a compliance officer, without that person to be able to ask questions, to be able to, again, bump things up against, so you get a better understanding of maybe there's some challenges from an ethical perspective. Maybe there's some challenges, from a compliance perspective. And that gap is probably one of the longest I've ever seen of a company trying to get to commercialization and hiring a compliance officer that late. There, in essence, there was no compliance program up until that point. And risk was never assessed at any program level, and it had no backing within the organization. They were just, let's drive forward. And then there was nothing from a compliance perspective, from a controls perspective, to have those checks and balances. And Seth and I often talk about a need for an overall compliance program to be assessed and implemented, again, fairly early. This just wasn't done. The whistleblower aspect I find interesting, and that's Tyler Schultz, who, again, I'll go into a lot of detail around Tyler, but he was the grandson of George Schultz, who was a board member and former either Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. And he started complaining in April 2014 about QC issues, quality control issues. And what's interesting, I have a few different notes here that I wanted to cover. And again, that same podcast that I mentioned earlier had really great nuggets of information as to what was happening within Theranos during this time. And Tyler had said he had seen examples of people speaking up, and it always ended up bad. And what he meant by that, what he then went on to say was they would often be fired on the spot. And again, that was part of this culture, a very aggressive, a very litigious culture. They were also afraid because they were, he mentioned, higher paid than most other companies in that space. So they were getting very, very good salaries, very strong salaries. But also another piece was, and I found this fascinating, many were afraid because they had relocation packages because they came from other areas. And they were afraid that the company would claw those back. And he said he heard that more often than not, that this was a big issue on some of the people that wanted to speak up, but they didn't. Another aspect here is that there was he said there was no whistleblower hotline. And he said, even if there was, the people would most likely be afraid of who would be on the end of that hotline. And he mentioned specifically that it would be Sonny who would end up hearing that on the back ends. And it really interesting concept, because we deal with a lot of clients that have a hotline, and we find that to be a great piece. But I never thought often about how it's just not being used because of an aggressive culture like this. And the other thing he said is raising concerns was seen as vindictive there. And he says that it would be considered career suicide. And I found that interesting because, again, a whistleblower coming forward, it shouldn't have that final result happen. One of the things that we like to talk about when you have lackable compliance is what's the culture like? And the culture really needed to be changed, in this case, to be able to handle what was happening from a risk perspective, and it wasn't. And the last thing I'll say is that I thought it was interesting that Tyler and his grandfather didn't speak. That was mentioned on the previous session for quite some time, or maybe we talked about it in our prep. That happened for quite some time, that they didn't speak. They ended up reconciling. However, the grandfather, Schultz, he ended up passing away recently, but they did end up reconciling, which I thought was great, because they went for a while, and Elizabeth was really driving a wedge between them by talking about how Tyler was wrong. He was, really raising concerns that they need to be in there, et cetera, et cetera. But one more last thing was people come up to Tyler often today and say this is happening at their firm. And I know Seth's going to go into this in more depth, but I find that fascinating that even to today that this is happening, and it's not being, again, you're not building compliance controls, or it's not being understood in the larger scale capacity. And that's a big challenge.
It is a big challenge, and we see it and Manny and I are seeing it every day. So Theranos is not unique in a lot of this.
Not at all.
And that leads me to the next slide. Theranos is not the first company to get themselves into trouble with defrauding investors in the life sciences space. So we've confined it to this. But if you go back to 2008, some of you may remember Harkonnen and Intermune. Harkonnen was convicted for lying and making fraudulent press releases. He tried to claim First Amendment protections, which the Ninth Circuit rejected. He then tried to appeal it to the Supreme Court, who refused to even take the appeal. Ultimately, he ends up being pardoned by Donald Trump in 2021. But again, Theranos, the facts around Theranos are fascinating. It's certainly an amazing case study, but what is, I think, troubling to both Manny and myself is the fact that they aren't the only ones out there.
No.
These cases are unusual, so let me preface it with that.
Yeah.
But they're not unique.
There are always some bad apples, we say, right, Seth?
There are always some bad apples, and this slide sort of indicates the bad apples. Again, This is a collection of quotes that we just kind of assembled from our work that we've done. But if you look at a lot of senior executives, they say some pretty amazing and, quite frankly, troubling things. You have Richard Sackler, which everyone by this point, he's a household name at this point.
Yep.
But I think my favorite quote is in the bottom right corner from Lawrence Dowd, who was a former CEO of Rochester Drug Cooperative and was indicted and now is convicted of drug trafficking. That he couldn't believe how, and he wrote this in an email to his chief compliance officer, that he couldn't believe how much they were spending on compliance because there was no return on compliance. Compliance didn't give them any value. So in essence, a large part of what you see from how the companies get in trouble starts with that tone at the top. And it's an often overused phrase, but basically, when you have negative reactions to compliance, that often leads to poor compliance outcomes because people mirror what their leaders do. And that's just the nature of the game. So as Manny said, we did manage to pull some survey results. And again, the findings are troubling. This comes from a Ethics and Compliance Initiative 2020 survey, and we're looking just at US data alone. So we've taken out the global data. But when they did the survey of respondents, 21%, only 21% said that they thought their company had a strong ethical culture. Almost 50% said they actually had observed actual misconduct. 30% said that they were been pressured to compromise, ethical or compliance standards. And to Manny's point earlier about whistleblowers and people raising issues and being harassed or retaliated against, 79% said that they had experienced some form of retaliation for raising issues. So it's not, and these data are across industry. So this isn't just life sciences specific or medical device specific. This is across industry, American industry as a whole.
Yep.
And it's on the rise, which is also troubling. So It went up year on year about 7 points, and that's concerning. So this is becoming more the norm rather than the exception. So we're going to shift a little bit and take a look at what good compliance looks like and how it could help alleviate these kinds of situations happening in the future or happening to other companies as well. Manny, I'm going to turn it to you.
So thanks, Seth. So when we look at compliance, we look at, 3 specific pillars, right? And it's truth, it's honesty, and it's trust. And we think about this as being supported by objective evidence. But these are the 3 main areas that really need to be the foundation of a strong compliance program. And as Seth said before, some of those stats were really mind-blowing to us in that if you look at these 3 words and then compare it to the numbers that you saw on the previous slide, they really, really don't mesh with each other. And it's baffling how, again, these 3 pillars are not taken seriously at organizations, and it's all about growth and revenue and, progress, et cetera, without looking to understand, are we doing the right thing? Seth, you can go to the next slide.
Absolutely.
Thank you, sir. So when you look at a framework, you're looking around how do you execute with this? And there's often talk about the 8 elements of an effective compliance program, right? And we won't get into those 8 elements, but it's out there. There's some really great information on those. But we're looking at effectiveness having to answer 3 specific questions. The first being, is the company's compliance program, is it well designed? Have you really thought it out? Did you do your planning? Have you thought about what it is that you want to look for? Have you thought about any specific outliers that you're looking for? Have you put together a plan to start understanding what's out there? The second being, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? And that's really important because, we've seen a lot of training where people just click through while they're doing something else. They're just really not listening. They don't care. They just want to get through the training to check that box. And if that's happening, there's a bigger issue of they're not understanding what it is that of the compliance message, the compelling message that's coming forward. And it's really just a waste of time. We work with a lot of companies, and we help build out SOPs, standard operating procedures, and various policies. And recently we've been getting the pushback saying, if we build this, is anybody even going to read them? And we started to revise them to be more summary-ish, having actually a lot of the information on the back end, but having executive summary so at least they know what message it is that we want to get across. And we find that that's part of this being, again, applying this earnestly and trying to make a good faith effort. And does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? I think there's really great data points today that you could use around this. You could start looking at information coming through, from a compliance perspective. There were two other things that Schultz said on that podcast that I found interesting. The first thing is 2 data points that he would have looked at if he was compliance or if he was HR. One was there was a massive amount of turnover, and you saw a lot of turnover happening, but there were no questions asked as to why these people were leaving and why they were going somewhere else. And the other one was about again, the lack of a hotline and not having something like that in place. He thinks that was one of the challenges, and I think those are really good important parts to bring forward, because again, does it work in practice? Are you looking at data sets? Are you looking at data? Are you monitoring what's happening out there? Are you looking at audit reports? How could you now apply those back? And then also, we talk often in compliance in the area that we work as far as best faith effort. And I think that's really important. You have to make your best faith effort to make sure that the company is operating in a compliant manner, in an ethical manner, and in an effective manner. And if you don't have that best faith effort, challenges will then arise coming.
And I think another data point too that I look at is, is the compliance officer allowed in the room when the senior executives are debating various strategies, activities, etc.,
Yep.
or is he excluded from those conversations?
Yep.
Frequently in companies that get themselves into trouble, the compliance officer has no idea what's going on because senior leaders have kept him out of those conversations. They don't consult him. They don't talk to him. He's not privy to those conversations. He's not privy to the sidebar conversations that occur, when the executive teams are meeting. So there's all those practical aspects about it working in practice. So if he doesn't know what's going on, how can he help them and advise on a correct course of action?
Exactly. I'll take this one, Seth, as well, as we talked about. So there's multiple stakeholders here. Again, it comes from the top. The board of directors, senior leadership really have to buy into this to make it work. I think Seth's quote before was a great one. We spend too much money on compliance. You hear a lot of that. Sometimes we hear we don't want to know what we don't know, right? And that's what actually sparked Seth and my article around, hope is not a strategy. You want to know what you don't know. You want to know everything about it, because if there's a black swan event, it could take your company down. And that's the last thing you want to have happen. That's why it's important to have multiple stakeholders all involved in this. Obviously, the compliance team will be the hub. But again, you have the 2 leadership teams of board of directors and senior leadership, CEO, C-suite. You also have the individual functions, right? In life sciences, you have your medical teams, you have your commercial teams, you have your sales teams, you have your HR teams, you have your finance teams, et cetera. And those are all important to be part of this, to make sure, again, that you're looking for information and be able to catch it quickly before something larger would arise. And then also the legal team has to be part of this. And I think that's important that, Seth and I see a lot of organizations where, legal compliance might be part of legal. I personally don't think that's great. I think they should be separate from each other. Others disagree, but I do think they should be separate, but the legal team should have, say into what's happening from a compliance stakeholder perspective. The other point I mentioned before, there was actually a third point that I want to say around Tyler Schultz. And he said another red flag from a compliance perspective was Theranos was extremely siloed. And it's okay to be siloed, everybody's focused, but it was siloed purposely So one group wouldn't speak to the other. And nobody, the senior leadership wanted to make sure that there wasn't information transfer of some of those challenges that they were moving forward with, tests not working, outsourcing, things of that nature. They wanted to make sure that that didn't go out. So they were speaking to groups individually, and it was extremely siloed. Tyler had mentioned this in his suit and when he was bringing forth this information. And one of the things that he said in this podcast was the company can disagree, but it needs to disagree respectfully and come out, in a decision that everyone made together. I think that could be applied to politics today and many other different areas, but we won't go there for right now. Yeah. However, it's a great point. I really like what he said, but I thought the siloed component was really interesting.
And the siloed component is really important because if you look at you can find it anywhere, the traditional pharmaceutical or medical device product development chart, you'll see that it is actually getting a product on the market is a team sport. You need multiple disciplines and multiple different functions, and they all need to work together in order to get this thing across the finish line. So you need the chemists to develop the formulation. You need the formulation experts to figure out how to put it into a pill. You need the folks who run the animal trials and the folks who analyze the data for initial safety. You need the clinical folks to make assessments of how are we going to test the hypothesis that this is safe and effective in humans. So everybody has a role to play, and they all need to work together in order to get this across the finish line. And putting everybody in in strict silos with no information sharing going across the spectrum is a recipe for disaster.
Completely agree there, Seth. And I think the mutual respect that we have on this slide, so important. And again, when that's lacking, there's a big issue.
Yeah, it really does break down. So taking a look at this slide comes from many years ago. I worked for SmithKline Beecham, and then became GlaxoSmithKline ultimately. But our chief operating officer at the time was a guy by the name of J.P. Gagné. And he was addressing a group of us compliance folks in the company, and he was asked, okay, so what makes a good compliance officer? What's the role of compliance? And he coined the top three that he said, part of it is part missionary, that you have to believe in the objective of compliance despite the skeptics, and you have to essentially go out there and promote that compliance is good for business. Manny and I were chatting yesterday about this. I've been called the sales prevention department on multiple occasions, and
police. You're the police.
And the police. I've been called that too. It obviously has to be tempered. The passion has to be tempered with wisdom, but at the same time, it's important. There's a diplomatic component that goes along with this, is that you have to be able to deliver crucial messages and sometimes difficult messages to senior stakeholders in particular. And the goal here is to deliver the message, but not become the object of the attack. So they don't attack the messenger, they listen to the message. It's the message that's important. It's not who gives the message. So you want them to understand that. And so sometimes you're walking a line of diplomacy. Yes, you do have a policeman role. It should be my personal belief is it should be the minor role. If you're doing this well, because you're getting ahead of the curve, but you do need to have enforcement and accountability, because if there's no enforcement, no accountability, nobody takes it seriously.
Yep. Seth, I have a story about this. Years ago, and the person is not in the compliance industry or the life sciences industry anymore. But I was speaking to her, and you were talking about what an effective compliance program for her firm would look like. And she said, if we could get rid of all sales reps, that's when I'll be happy. I was like, well, if you get rid of all sales reps, you probably won't have much of a business. So you might not have a job, nor will the other 1,000 people around here. So I think it's important to balance some of these, right? There's nothing wrong with sales. If sales does its job accurately, they can be a great asset. It's when they try to cut the corners, right? When they try to, do the things that they're not supposed to be doing off label in our industry, right, Seth? Some other aspects.
Yeah, that's a problem. Two other aspects that I've added from my experience are, one, the compliance officer needs to be a quick study. To Mark's point, as he was going through the analysis around the difference between a laboratory developed test and a fully marketed test and those nuances, you've got to be able to pick up the ball and understand complex topics in a very short period of time. And it doesn't mean you have to be a subject matter expert in everything, but you have to have at least the working knowledge and the ability to know when you don't know something and bring those experts in. And then, to the point that Manny's been making all along, and I make it as well, is you need to be a bit of a curious George. In other words, you need to be comfortable asking the big question, why? When things don't look right or feel right, why is that? Why don't the data make sense? Why don't we have data at all? You need to ask those big picture questions and pursue them to get to the answers. Because if you don't ask the questions and you don't learn, then you can't figure out where the real problem is. So most compliance officers, we love to learn. We always want to hear what somebody else's viewpoint is. We're more than happy to have. I'm more than happy to have the sales reps teach me about how do you do this. I have great respect for the folks that carry the bag. It's a tough job, and getting to see it through their eyes is incredibly helpful. And so getting people to talk to you and to teach you is important, and being open to what they are teaching you. Now, you may need to help them make adjustments later on, but at least learn it from their point of view. And I think that's important for people.
Seth, I think that's such a great point, right? In the sense of one of the things that I noticed, in the compliance space in life sciences is you're dealing with a lot of different things. You might know commercial really well, but you might not know clinical, right? And the clinical trial, the R&D process is such a complex process to understand. But as Seth was saying before, quick study, you have to want to take in that information and learn it, right? And then be curious, ask those questions on why. And then if you're getting the answers they're just speaking in extremely esoteric terms and just the feel of a runaround, dig deeper into that. And that's what we find that great compliance officers and great compliance executives do. When it doesn't feel right, they dig deeper and they get that expertise needed to learn more about that specific topic. I love these last 2 points, Seth.
Thanks. So again, we're trying to boil it all down. When you're working inside from an effective compliance program, is basically you trust your people. You start from the assumption that the company hires good people with good character that are looking to do right by the patients and the company. But at the end of the day, you still have to verify it. There's got to be that objective evidence component. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking about nuclear missiles or we're talking about blood analyzers.
Yep.
The reality is you have to have data to back up what you're saying. Manny?
Great, thanks. So this is the case study that I mentioned earlier. And I'm really glad that I'm able to present this because it came to me by chance. I posted that we were doing this session on LinkedIn, and almost immediately somebody came back to me and said, hey, I had direct dealings with Elizabeth Sunny. Would you be interested in hearing more? And I said, absolutely. So this is a Fortune 100 company, very large organization, and they're dealing in their specific dealings with Theranos. They gave it to this resource, an attorney, a junior attorney at the time, and they said, see what you could see if this clears, give us your opinion. And this attorney, who's now in compliance, was asking the right questions, right? When it started, this is even prior to the Theranos deal with Walgreens. And they were calling it a magic kit, as I mentioned earlier, which again, it's okay to call it a magic kit, but you wanted to dig deeper into some questions. In the room with this attorney were Elizabeth Sunny, and then Elizabeth's brother, who was their general counsel. Now that alone raises some eyebrows because it's a GC needs to be unbiased, right? Have not a direct, intimate relationship with a CEO or C-suite, and that wasn't happening at the time. But table that for a second. But again, this attorney was asking the right questions. Is your medical lab testing device, or is it approved? Is it cleared by FDA and or CMS? The answer was no. All right, you must have a PMA or 510K clearance. Now, I think in the previous session, there was eventually 510K clearance for the herpes test, but at this point there was none. And their answer was no. Okay, and then they said, okay, there's a few other questions. Is your main lab certified? In the process. Okay, so it's not certified. Could we do a pilot in our stores? Maybe one of our stores do a pilot, get some data back. No. Can you give us a document from outside counsel or anything that could validate that this is something real? They did get a document, but it was very vague. And then they asked a question, can you give us the name of the CMS person you contacted? This person or the level above was X, one of the government agencies, I believe it was FDA, but I'm not sure, and had contacts there. And they said no. So if you want to go to the next slide, Seth, this is where it gets interesting. When they said no about this company reaching out to one of the government agencies, I believe it was CMS they were looking for. Theranos came back with their law firm, and they were using Boys, which is out there. John Carreyrou covered this in great detail in his book and a lot of the podcasts. But they step in as the Theranos counsel, and this company decides this doesn't feel right. Again, that smell test, that gut feeling, it's not. We don't want to go down this route, so they terminate their deal, their discussions with Theranos. What's interesting is then he called this a reverse litigation hold. And I had not heard that term before, and also I forgot to mention earlier, I'm not an attorney. I'm just a consultant who deals in compliance matters. I'll leave that up. The attorney, the language is up to all you attorneys, but I'm not that. But what's interesting about this reverse litigation hold is that this law firm, Boys and Company, they required the company to gather all information and notes related to the proposed project, including backups offsite, and confirming that they were destroyed. And they really were adamant about this, is make sure that everything has been destroyed. There's there's nothing in place that would even tie us together. And this resource, the attorney had to go to many different campuses and make sure personally that these things were destroyed. But it comes back to the extremely litigious nature of Theranos. And I found that interesting. Now, Seth, if you go to the last slide.
Well, I'll add here, it's not uncommon in our industry, because we are dealing with intellectual property and proprietary information.
Completely agree.
That when you're working with outside parties, you're required to sign a non-disclosure agreement. They're pretty much part and parcel of our industry that says,
yes,
whatever the two parties share amongst each other cannot be shared with anybody else without the other party's agreement. And everybody abides by that. And when we're done with the deal, or the deal goes down, you're not going to use this for anything else. This result, or this push from the law firm, is abnormal. You've got to not only destroy everything, you have to go confirm that you've destroyed everything and certify that you've destroyed everything. That is not normal in our industry at all.
Yep.
So that is a highly aggressive stance.
Yep.
And very unusual.
Yep.
For Manny and myself, these are things that, if a client came to us and said, what do you think about this? Our red flags would go up. We'd say,
exactly. And that's what's great about some of the books and the podcasts and all the media that's been associated with this. They all talk about this, how aggressive they were. from a litigation perspective. And again, somebody like Elizabeth almost she did drive a wedge between grandfather and grandson, and utilizing attorneys to do this as well. It's just, again, I think Seth, you said it correctly. It was a bit overboard, and that's a red flag, right?
Yep.
So there is I don't want to say happy, ending here, but the compliance in essence saved the day. They asked the right question, right? That somebody like a good CCO would. In this case, it was an attorney, but they asked the right questions, during these negotiations. They trusted their experience and their gut feel that something was not right. And that's an important thing in compliance. Sometimes, what good looks like, you also know what not good looks like. And when you have that and it's in your gut, you need to go with it, because it's just such an important part of the compliance aspect. And, I'm CEO of a firm, it's named Helio Argos, that has next generation technology, machine learning, artificial intelligence, NLP, all those acronyms. But one of the things that's interesting, and Seth and I talked about it before yesterday, was we do a lot of the data scrubbing, a lot of data analysis, and we have these really great tools to understand where there might be some outliers. But there also needs to be somebody there that has that gut feel and a human to make some judgment calls and things of that nature. And that will never go away. And that's why this compliance space is so needed within an organization. The other thing is you need to conduct independent due diligence and with the information you have. And if you don't get the information, you have to make sure that you either get it or you start to raise those flags. Now, here's the result, which I found very, very interesting. No recognition from the company whatsoever. Nothing, not anything to today. Nobody has ever said anything to this person. There was not even a thank you. And if you think about it, the Walgreens deal was, what did we say, 500 million. Safeway was, I thought I saw 350. This would have been potentially larger or similar to one of those. And, think about how much scrutiny that this person saved the organization. And again, not even a thank you, which takes us to our next slide. Which I don't know if anybody's ever read Taleb, but Taleb is, in my opinion, one of the great economists / philosophers / thinkers out there. And this is from his book, Anti-Fragile. You could also look at Black Swan, and he just wrote one, Skin in the Game, over the last 2 years or so. But this quote I love. The true hero in the Black Swan world is someone who prevents a calamity. And naturally, because the calamity did not take place, does not get recognition or a bonus for it. And the example that Taleb gives is, let's say the FAA had an executive on September 10th, 2001, who said, we want to put locks on all the cockpits in every plane across the nation, and you have to do it ASAP by tomorrow. That person would be ridiculed. Why do we need this extra cost? Why do we need this? Why do we need to do it, period? And obviously everybody knows the result of something like this. And that person would never see the recognition or, again, any of the accolades of doing what he or she did. I think that's an important part of this. And also,
I can add from personal experience.
Please.
Early on in my career, I had a senior executive who shall remain nameless.
Yeah.
In the middle of when we were doing the performance review, you hit all your marks. You've done a great job. You've gone above and beyond. But we're not going to give you the highest rating that we could possibly give you, even though you've gone above and beyond, or a really big bonus, because you're not in sales and marketing.
Yeah.
Since you're not in sales and marketing, what you do doesn't count.
Yep. Amazing. I think another interesting thing, and I'll give a quick story, Seth, as well. I started my career in many of the areas of commercial that you just said. I was a rep at Novartis, Ciba-Geigy. I did a rotation in the field. I was on the brand side. I was in marketing. And then I got into the technology part. I got into Salesforce technology and various aspects of IT, CRM tools, et cetera. And then eventually I got into compliance, but I got into it by accident. At a company I was with, FICO, it was called Fair Isaac at the time, which many of you in Minnesota may know because they're headquartered out of there. I was part of the life sciences team there and doing very deep analytics. It was like going back to school. They were doing well advanced of anybody else at the time. And somebody dropped a proposal on my desk and said, "Hey, if you want it, you take it." And it was for an area called aggregate spend in life sciences, and they wanted to build a system. And I was like, "Yeah, I'll take this." And I got into it, and then I got into other aspects of compliance, and I realized how important this area was for life sciences. I didn't know much about it. Again, growing up and coming through the ranks of the commercial side or the IT side or the other roles that I played. But I thought it was fascinating that that this area, number one, existed, and even more so, was such a strategic area for organizations if they allowed it to be. Now, that being said, I saw somebody who I used to work with on the commercial side years later at a pharma campus, and he's like, "What are you doing now?" I'm like, "Compliance." He's like, "Oh man, that stuff's boring, right? Like it's the worst." And I was like, "Nah, not really." Because Seth's point is, you know everything about the organization. You have to touch upon everything and have your, an understanding of all these different spots, all these different divisions. I find it fascinating. It's such a great career path for many folks, and either they don't know about it, or again, they think it's just writing a bunch of policies, but it's so much more than that. And again, I think this is important to talk about with that true hero part.
I agree.
Seth, back to you.
Well, we're getting close to time, so we're going to wrap it up here.
Yep.
I think one of probably our primary message here is that the stuff we're talking about, compliance in general, none of this is rocket science.
Yep.
None of this is really, implementation is difficult, but the concepts really aren't difficult. Yep. So, some of the lessons from Theranos is don't ignore the red flags. If something seems to be too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. And you should trust your gut and check. Also be sensitive to those mismatches between corporate rhetoric and action. One of my favorites is always the companies who say people are our most important asset, and yet they're always trying to make them work harder, trying to not promote them, trying not to reward them, not to give them bonus, even though the company is making millions or billions of dollars. So be sensitive to those mismatches because they're not walking the talk. Be sensitive to the constant arguments about money or what I would call other silly stuff. If somebody's fighting really hard about some minor issue, it can be a sign that they're trying to misdirect you. People tend to really argue silly stuff when there's something else going on behind the scenes, and it's worth trying to figure out what that is. Yep. Because they're really trying to get into a non-substantive discussion about something that doesn't really matter. Ask why, push for your answers that make sense, and be sensitive to the people who are giving you answers, because we all have bias, even compliance officers. We have our own biases based on our experiences. Be aware of, both real conflicts of interest and apparent conflicts of interest, both in-house and outside. And where people are not being transparent. In particular, as we talked about, this is a device that was essentially a black box and nobody knew how the insides worked. It was sort of and a miracle happens here. Well, that doesn't work in our world. This is a data-driven process. It's got to have facts and data to back it up. Look for the supporting data. A lot of times there's always, there's a tendency. Everybody wants to be right, as Manny's pointed out. So there's a tendency to bury the unflattering data or to ignore them and not use them to inform the decisions. It's easier, quite honestly, guys. One of the reasons we talk about the faith so much is it's easier to rely on faith and belief than it is to go out and dig out the facts and the data. And in our world, if it's not documented, then it didn't happen. And we hear that from the regulators. Compliance officers will tell you the same thing. Look, there's got to be some sort of backup here. You can't just will it to be so. And last but not least, and again, the chickens are coming home to roost in a way for Theranos at the moment. Yep. But you got to hold people accountable, and accountability is got to be done regardless of your title, their background, or past performance. We have seen, Manny and I have seen time and time again, there's always a tendency to defer to the senior leadership or high performers to somehow justify or explain away their bad behavior. Well, they're the senior leaders, or he's made us millions of dollars in sales. There's always an attempt to try to explain away the bad behavior, and you really can't do that. It's not fair. But it's also human nature, and you have to acknowledge that people want to avoid responsibility when things go wrong. When things go wrong, everybody starts running for the hills and starts pointing fingers. And you really need to get to the bottom of what really happened. And if it happened, fix it. I mean, compliance is not necessarily looking for people to blame. In fact, that's quite the anathema to what we're trying to do. We're trying to correct the issues. So let's figure out what went wrong, take a step back and fix it so it doesn't happen again. That way we stay out of trouble. That way we keep being able to market. That way we keep the trust of our stakeholders. And by that, I mean the patients, the providers, the regulators, the investors, and people trust it. People only want to do business with companies and people that they trust. So we need to maintain that trust if we want to be successful. And I think that's really all we had. Manny, you had anything else? Any parting words?
I know. I think we said it all, and I think we're right on time, right, Hannah?
We are, yes. So thank you both so much for being here and for the practical advice you offered about the gaps in Theranos' compliance program. I personally found the intersection of the importance of these systemic controls and the human elements really striking. It also seems like compliance is kind of a thankless job. So thank you for highlighting the importance of it in light of that.
Totally agree.
Hannah, it is a thankless job. I have told people who in my department who I've hired, if you want, attaboys go into sales and marketing, your good day is going to be somebody doesn't yell at you.
That very true. You get yelled at a lot, Hannah, a lot.
I'm wondering if I went into the right field now, but
you just have to have you just have to have confidence in what you know,
sure,
confidence in who you are, and to learn to stand your ground.
Well, thank you for that. And next, we'll move on to our Q&A portion of the event. So I'll have all of our speakers turn on your cameras. Amanda and Mark, if you are available here, thank you. Okay, so this is just a reminder for the group at large to submit any questions through the chat. Depending on time, you may be able to raise your hand and ask them in person, but it might be easier to manage the inflow of questions just by using that chat feature. We'll get to as many questions as we can here. And just generally for our panel, if there is a question that seems like it's targeted to, one group or the other, feel free for everyone to kind of chip in. And we really want it to be kind of a discussion with a lot of discourse here. So we had a really good question submitted about this tendency. I mean, the facts of the Theranos case are just strikingly unique. And there is some discussion about whether there's a tendency to view what happened in this case as completely unique in the field. So I'm curious, if this is open to the panel, if you agree with that view. And if the underlying facts are not unique, is there a solution to address them?
I could kick it off. And I think this was said by Mark and Amanda, but the fake it till you make it component of this was, we don't see that in life sciences often, right? As Mark had said, this is a tricky area. It's not tech, right? It's not consumer goods. It's not automotive. It's dealing with people's lives, and the fake it till you make it model does work in many of those other fields. but in my opinion, it will never work in life sciences.
Yeah, I don't think you can make it work in life sciences. That said, I think the part of this that's true is I do think there are ways, and we have seen it with breakthrough products do happen that do disrupt the industry as a whole.
Yep.
So disruption in the industry is something that's not unique. It's
Yep.
rare. It's rare that you hit the thing out of the park with a blockbuster. But we certainly can say we have a recent example of that with the COVID-19 vaccines. The speed at which we developed those vaccines, and the effectiveness level of those vaccines that came about are certainly home runs that we don't see very often. And it disrupted, obviously, the pandemic. So it's possible. But again, in all of those cases, again, with the cases of vaccines, you had facts, data, and science to back it up. So when you say it's 90% effective, you have data that proves it's 90% effective.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. The fact that so much money was invested in this company and so many people were duped is, I think, an anomaly. It's very unusual. Ultimately, I remember when Manny and Seth and Amanda and I and others from the team, Barbara and Thad, and met to talk about this CLE. It was like, well, and I thought Manny and Seth had really enjoyed your presentation about preventative aspects. And it's like, well, how do you prevent this from happening again? It's like, my comment was, there's criminal acts here. Lying to people about something that doesn't exist is beyond the pale. And we work with drug and device companies every day, and we don't work with people that lie. I hope, that are just blatantly like, hey, we've got this magic box. I like that term. I hadn't heard that term, but that's just it's kind of like, it's silly. It's fiction, and I people that work in healthcare, just you've got people's lives in the balance, and if you're saying this warfarin, what your warfarin level is, if you give the wrong answer, you could kill someone or make them worse off. It's just.
And Mark, there was an example I saw that there were two examples. One person was told they had cancer and they didn't, right? Another person was told they were infertile and she wasn't. And again, you're playing with people's lives here. And I think that's part of it. That's
in the trial, they allowed the patients to testify about their incorrect results, but they did not allow them to talk about their emotional, financial. But there was somebody who was diagnosed with HIV, somebody who was told they were miscarrying. I mean, these are real. And this industry is so heavily regulated for good reason. We have FDA, we have, OIG, we have DOJ. If you are truly kind of following all the rules, these facts are very rare. There's just too many controls in place by design to prevent this type of activity.
Yep.
Do you think that Theranos saw themselves as more of a technology company, and that's why they played a little fast and loose with these, standard health regulatory rules? And if so, how long do you think it took them to realize that they were dealing in the health, in life science space?
I think they did to a certain extent see themselves as technology companies. Manny and I were talking about this earlier. Most of the times, especially with smaller startup companies, what we see with folks is it's not that they're trying to get around the rules, which ultimately Theranos was trying to do. It's they're ignorant of the rules. They don't know what the rules are in this particular space. So we spend a lot of our time from a compliance perspective educating senior leaders as to what are the rules and why are the rules there and why are they important, because they're things that they don't necessarily think about. They're focused on they're focused on building the product and getting the product out there to help people because they truly believe whatever they're doing is going to help people. They just don't realize that there are all these checks and balances and steps and process that are put into place for reasons that we've discussed, because you have people's lives in the balance.
Yep, that's a great question, Hannah, whoever asked it. But I will say, you can't do it both, right? Like in tech, you're going to have bugs, right? Like think about when Apple rolls out a new OS and some parts don't work. They don't work together. That happens in a human being. You have a big issue here. That's why there's so many tests needed. That's why all these government agencies are needed to control all of this. And it's different. But I think she was looking at this as like a tech company, being there out there in Silicon Valley, having the access to that Silicon Valley money, and then just trying to tie it into healthcare. It often doesn't work. Google tried this with Verily, I believe. I think that's their healthcare unit, and they didn't have success in an early clinical trial. And a lot of the biotech experts are like, this stuff is hard, right? It's not as easy as just applying tech to it.
And Mark, I'm sure you could speak to I remember the days of when the wearables were first coming out.
Yeah.
And folks were realizing that all of a sudden what they were asking these wearables to do was actually turning it into a medical device. And oh my gosh, now I have to go seek approval.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think, Hannah, that they did have this tech kind of philosophy. That said, we work with a lot of device companies, many in the Bay Area, that they will hire people occasionally from other sectors, and there's a learning curve for them because the kind of pumping up without facts behind and evidence behind a claim, all claims have to be truthful and not misleading, or they misbrand a medical device or drug. And if there isn't support for claims, then that person and the company is committing a crime. So that's fundamental with a lot of these, with drug and device companies. The sophisticated ones appreciate that. In tech, I haven't worked in tech, but it seems to me there's maybe a bit more showmanship, a bit more, like Manny said, work out the bugs later kind of approach, where I don't think that's tolerated in healthcare, with FDA. Of course, no product or drug is ever perfect. If you give, what do we have, 7.5 billion people on the planet, if you gave every one of them a drug that was just approved as safe and effective, and maybe even if it's something innocuous, it's probably going to make someone sick, so there's always risk associated with healthcare products. There's inherent risk, maybe not of course some are lower risk, but with the devices and whatnot, or just to get back to your question, I do think they had this tech philosophy, and it's just incompatible with healthcare. At least the move fast and break things part of it, that part is not compatible.
Yeah, the speed of innovation and kind of the ability to innovate quickly is another big challenge that kind of butts heads between medical device companies and tech companies, because you're not able to, unfortunately, in most cases, quickly make changes, where you have to go through verification, validation, potentially an FDA submission every time you want to make a change that could impact the product. So that's another, big piece that I think people coming from the tech industry or other industries into the medical device space, I think they have a really hard time with that. Because it's slow. It's a lot slower, unfortunately, because of the controls that are in place.
I'll give one more quick anecdote. I remember the word or the phrase "lean into," that was kind of a buzzword for a while. You still hear it. And I had this commercial leader at a good-sized company, and we're talking about some product messaging and whether it was off-label, and it was. And his response to me was, and I'm outside counsel, but he's like, "Well, we're going to lean into that risk." And I just kind of stopped and said, "We're going to lean into illegal acts?" That's in my mind. And I'm talking to the GC, and we're just like, "Yeah, no, you're not leaning into that." But that's kind of another example of how the industries are different.
Great.
Tim had somewhat of a related question in the chat. So I think regardless of whether Theranos thought they were a tech company or a life science company, everyone can agree that it seems like they raised funds quickly and they were very politically connected. So what role do you think that the board and political tax played in potentially suppressing scrutiny of, claims that were being lodged against Theranos prior to the trial and charges.
So just to unpack that question, what was the role of the kind of celebrity on?
What role did Theranos's board and political context play in potentially suppressing scrutiny? So like, I think there was a little bit of that in the podcasts. They like to tell people that they were working with the government and working with, so I think that was part of it. They wanted that. So maybe people would be less, would have less scrutiny if they are working with the government. I think part of that, I don't know if anyone else has a political spin on that or how they work politically.
Yeah, I don't think like having all these big shots, whether they were former politicians or in the military or whatever they were, I don't know how much that impacted this sort of suppression, if you will, of the truth. I think that they were, unfortunately, these individuals never asked the questions. And if you read the book, there's one individual that was on the board and he started asking tough questions. And he was removed very quickly, so anybody that pushed back, it didn't matter who they were, if they're the board, an engineer, CFO. Well, they had a very famous, a talented CFO, that another person that started on early, and he heard some issues with the device, and he asked Holmes about it, and she fired him. So if you kind of stuck your head up, you were fired. It kind of goes back to Seth and you guys were talking about Hotline, and it was that if they hadn't a hotline, it might as well have been the fire line, because if it was anything to do with the fire. So I do think that this is just a bizarre anomaly. How can any company operate this way? It doesn't make any sense. It was doomed to fail, and it's just incredible that hundreds of millions of dollars were invested in essentially it was like a criminal enterprise that they just lied to people about what they had. It's very strange.
Switching gears a little bit, this question might be for Amanda and Mark, but we have a question about the future of LDT legislation and how likely is it that Congress is going to pass legislation to make the FDA regulate LDTs without enforcement discretion? Do you want to take that one?
So, there's been kind of a back and forth on this topic for historically, I'll say. The Ballot Act has been proposed in different iterations many times. And so we currently have this act sitting there. To my knowledge, it's not really getting any traction. I'm guessing COVID is kind of a reason for that. But I do feel that the Ballot Act probably gained some momentum based on Theranos and kind of the story and all the media attention that it garnered. I just don't see a lot of activity occurring. I don't see big changes happening in the LDT space. I think the Ballot Act is too big, and we could do a whole CLE on that. But essentially, it would create a separate category that FDA would regulate, and it would require an entire structure of a review branch and a division head, and market pathways, like submission pathways, kind of like a 510K PMA. It's a huge undertaking. So I just don't see it changing in the near future. But it's important to remember that the enforcement discretion is just that. It's enforcement discretion. So FDA can choose to exercise their enforcement authority over them if they need to. I don't know, Mark.
Yeah, if they passed it tomorrow, I'm not sure what the agency would do. Like DSHEA, came out in 1994, that regulated supplements as a law for Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. And FDA didn't enforce that law for, I think, close to a decade or longer. They just kind of ignored it because they were like, we don't have the infrastructure to take this on, and implementing regulations under, I think it was part. I can't remember if it's 101, but they were, they were still going into place in the last decade, even the law was passed in 1994. So if I were the new commissioner here and they said, hey, you now need to approve all these LDTs, that would be incredible. It's like saying, hey, you're gonna have to approve all the compounded drugs out there too, and every pharmacy across the country. Good luck. You're gonna have to inspect those facilities. I don't know, because just as we talked about earlier, a lab like Mayo Clinic, they're creating their own assays for testing, and they're not going to the FDA to have those cleared. I suppose they could have some sort of maybe like monograph, like they do with pharmaceuticals or drugs that are low risk, where you'd have to follow a monograph, in other words, like a cookbook recipe. But I don't know. It's interesting. I also think it's interesting that Pallone is a lawmaker that's been behind that, and he's out of New Jersey, which is where Quest is. I can't remember if there was support from the congressional delegation, North Carolina. I thought maybe there was. I'm not sure on that. But that law would benefit. It might benefit those big labs, Quest, LabCorp. It might benefit makers of reagents like Quest, if makes reagents, if my memory is correct. Roche certainly does. There's others, because they could then say, hey, our reagents are cleared. You can't make your own assays anymore. So long story short, I agree with Amanda. I don't really see a lot of movement on it, but who knows?
Do you think that same rationale applies to all direct consumer, wellness test panels, things like that?
A lot of those are regulated as LDTs, like the 23andMe and the Everlywell. A lot of them have their own Clia lab. And so the samples are, they try carefully. And I think some of them actually do have cleared devices as well, based on the claims they want to make and based on how they're used. But yeah, a lot of those are regulated as LDTs. So they have a Clia lab, and they're not necessarily getting clearance from FDA for those direct to consumer tests.
And to your point, Amanda, some of what, like the 23andMe, they stopped making claims that it would actually diagnose anything.
Exactly.
And this is for your own interest.
Yep.
If you're interested in your ancestry or your genetic background, we will provide you information for interest. So they're really not making any kind of diagnostic claim anymore, which kind of takes them out of FDA's regulatory gun sights.
And they got in trouble. I don't know. Must have been.
They did.
A bit ago, maybe now, but they were doing just that. Oh, do you want to know?
Yes, they did, and they changed because of that.
Yeah, it's like.
Yep, they did.
Yeah.
Well, we're down to just about 5 minutes left here. So in our time remaining, I was hoping we could just do a round table. And if everyone could give their biggest takeaway from this case in terms of, either future prevention or mitigation strategies, where they went wrong, just one big headline takeaway.
I could kick it off. In my opinion, it's no compliance officer. That was such a huge part of this. No compliance program. If they did, I don't know if it would have stopped them, because again, the messaging from the top was again very aggressive and very non-compliant, very again, fake it till you make it. But if they would have put in a compliance team 2007, 2008, some of the bigger, funding rounds coming in, utilizing that money appropriately and making sure that everything is again okay with regulations and some different things, I think it would have changed the narrative. It might have taken them longer to come to commercialization, but I think it would have changed the trajectory of the firm. And they might still be in business right now with the herpes test, right? With additional tests, smaller markets, and then keep gaining until her goal of trying to change healthcare, as she always talked about.
I would add to that would be careful about suspending disbelief, even because you want it to be so. Make sure that you ask the card questions and get good answers, and that there's data to back up what you want to be true, and be sensitive to the fact that everybody has bias.
Very good. Mark and Amanda?
I would say don't lie.
That was mine.
Oh, that's such a lawyer answer.
I know. But also just, I mean, there's so many things that went wrong in this case, but I think one of the biggest ones which kind of prompted the unraveling was not knowing the industry, not knowing the diagnostic space, not knowing how FDA views things, messy submissions. I think they had 3 or 4 that were under review that they just never responded and ended up withdrawing. So I think it was just lack of sophistication with the regulations applicable to the industry. And I think just doing your due diligence on that kind of stuff when you're starting, getting the right experts on board to help. At least knowing enough to know when you need to call an expert. I think that's what Seth and Manny had mentioned as well.
I think that's right. I mean, honestly, the don't lie thing is fundamental here, and it's I think it starts with a little white lie, and then it just Pinocchio's nose just keeps on growing. But the other thing that we do see in this space in diagnostics, because we work with some diagnostics makers and some laboratories, and that group in general has gone, or that sector has faced less regulation from a federal FDA standpoint, but it's starting to increase. And so I think that if I were going to run a lab, invest in a lab, I'd want to talk with an FDA like for an hour to at least appreciate what's going on. Because if you're a central lab and specimens are coming in, you can take advantage of this LDT exception. And if you've made your assay and if you have some equipment, perhaps you can take advantage of the exception, but that's the foundation of your business then. So you want to be airtight on that. And I think with Holmes, I think she was at the end of the day most interested in being rich and a celebrity. She was asked by an adult at a party when she was 9 what she wanted to be when she grew up. She said a billionaire, and they said, well, don't you want to be the president? She said, no, if I have $1 billion, the president will want to marry me. So unfortunately, I think there is a big drive in the Valley too to get rich and be the next Larry Ellison or Mark Zuckerberg or whomever. And they just got so far out over their skis on this. It was nobody wanted to admit that this was just a train wreck. And ultimately, all they were doing, just to simplify it too, they're trying to take a huge machine and make it into a little machine. And at the end of the day, there are limits on the physics of science's ability to do that. Maybe in the future, but I think it's just too soon right now.
So I'm hearing know your science, don't lie, and call an expert if you get in over your head, which includes anyone on this panel. So there you go. And with that, we are at our time. Andrea will be emailing out the information about the CLE credit and as well as the recording from today's presentation. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to our wonderful panel.
Thanks, Anna.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you
Thanks,
guys.
Hannah.
Take
Bye.
care, everyone.
Bye-bye.